Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Horus. Two notes before I start this episode. First off, an apology to Enisu, who requested Atlas. I don't want to do a conquest video of Atlas until they've brought back Warflag, because it is really impactful on him right now, and to do so would not be an accurate portrayal of how effective Atlas can be in the support role. Secondarily, a power stand, is it a power stand or the power stand? But the power stand commented a couple of days ago saying that Horus, correctly pointing out that Horus is even better now with the new itemization, and that is 100% accurate, and I wanted to talk about it. So the instant that Warflag comes back as an item, you'll see Atlas. But in the meantime, let's cover Horus again, because I do want to go back over his itemization. Now, just to refresh everyone's memory on this, just in case you didn't see previous videos, or maybe you've forgotten, Horus's kit is extremely straightforward except for two things. First is the gust auto attack, this right here. Boom. That wind gust. There are two really important things to know about that. One, that is a basic attack. It counts as a basic attack. It will trigger basic attack procs, not ability item procs. Alright? Very important distinction there. Furthermore, it does additional damage anytime the opponent is popped up into the air, regardless of source. It does not have to be this updraft that pops them up. It can be anything. It can be Bacchus's belly flop. It can be Sylvanas' ult. It can be whatever. Okay? Secondly, for Fracture, his second ability, the protection reduction happens on the second hit. That one right there, which incidentally also counts as an ability hit. That is not an auto attack, that is an ability hit. Alright? Now, with those specifics out of the way, let's talk support and solo Horus. Alright? Now, I want to talk about both of these because the way I build solo lane Horus and the way I build support Horus is somewhat similar, but there is a more aggressive version of solo lane Horus that I will be talking about building for. But I want to start with support Horus because, in my opinion, it's his better role. Now, when I play support Horus, I am primarily looking at Sentinel's Gift, and the primary reason why is because later on in the game I want to be building Sentinel's Embrace. Why is this? This is because of Protector's Surge very specifically. You see, most supports, they have to initiate a lot of the times. They're the primary initiator of their team, so they're not necessarily always going to be right there next to their allies when their allies need them. Horus does not have this problem. In any given moment, as long as Protector's Surge is up, you can fly to an ally in need, heal them, increase their protections, and have the aura from Sentinel's Embrace in the late game that gives them even more protections. Alright, so just by flying to them, boom. In less time than it takes to sizzle a burger, you've provided them with protections. Alright? Really big deal. This is why I primarily go into Sentinel's Embrace with Horus. I'll only go into Sentinel's Boon in Arena and Assault. Mostly because during a lot of those team fights, because it's all one area, for Arena it's just this giant area, for Assault it's a single lane, there's always minions kicking around and dying that are going to be healing you, your health and mana. Outside of those two modes, I am always going for Sentinel's Embrace, with one exception. If there is an absurd amount of magic damage on the enemy team, I will go into Benevolence and then go into Compassion. Now, why is this? Well, first off, obviously, Compassion gives you higher magic protections right off the top, and you can achieve a very similar effect with the aura of Compassion. Damage taken by allied gods is reduced by 15% and is reflected to you as magic damage. Since the enemy team in this particular instance is already predominantly magic damage, you're already going to have the magical protections to mitigate that anyways, right? It's lovely. However, another interesting thing about a primarily magic comp is, assuming that the enemy ADC is also a mage, a lot of mage ADCs have a relatively weaker early game than hunters. The primary reason for this is because mage auto attacks only have 20% power scaling, whereas physical auto attacks have 100%, if you didn't know. Therefore, because of that lower scaling on mage auto attacks, mage ADCs like Sol, Chronos, or Freya, they don't hit quite as hard in the early game as their physical counterparts do. So even though Benevolence offers you fewer benefits than Sentinel's Gift in the early game, to the point where I don't really like Benevolence, because of that weaker early game of mage ADCs, you can actually typically get away with this in those specific circumstances. And then by the time you really need the magic protections, you can bust out Compassion. Alright? So with the sole exception of magic damage heavy enemy team compositions, I am going into Sentinel's Gift, I am going into Sentinel's Embrace. Alright, it is just important to note that the Compassion is a really great choice for mage heavy teams. Alright, now for the second item, I do almost always build Gauntlet of Thebes. Now, why Gauntlet of Thebes specifically? Why not Prophetic Cloak? Why not necessarily Sovereignty or Heart Ward? Well, first let me deal with Sovereignty and Heart Ward. I do build those as a second item if, again, the enemy team composition has an unusually high emphasis on that damage. If there's 4 physicals, I'm not even going to bother with Gauntlet of Thebes, right? Gauntlet of Thebes isn't worth building for one magic damage source. I'll just build Fate Blessed Hoops as my 4th item and run with that, right? Alternatively, with the Compassion instance, going back to that mage-heavy enemy team composition of 4 or 5 magic damage sources, again, with that particular circumstance, I'd just grab Heart Ward as a second item and then just roll with 1 or 2 physical items later on down the road, right? However, such team compositions are very rare outside of Assault, so generally speaking, Gauntlet of Thebes is my go-to. Now, to answer the question on Prophetic Cloak and why I don't bother with that on Horus specifically is because Prophetic Cloak's stacks stack upon dealing damage to specific enemies, right? And the problem for Horus is he's only got 2 abilities that are going to be consistently used for damage, because if anyone has played Horus extensively before, this ult isn't necessarily always going to be used for damage. It's just as frequently being used to slip allies past the enemy defenses, maybe grab a surprise Phoenix or the Titan, maybe you're using it to ambush the enemy at a jungle boss and you're trying to steal the jungle boss, it's not about the damage. Maybe you accidentally hit someone, maybe you don't. Maybe you're just using it as a ganking maneuver, right, and maybe you miss. Also, considering how long it takes for that ability to actually land and that enemies can see that landing zone, it's very easy to dodge that as well. So it's not really reliably used for damage in a lot of situations. And of course, Protector's Surge, it doesn't do damage. So that's not going to trigger a stack of Prophetic Cloaks. So in total, you have only 2 abilities that are going to consistently be capable of stacking this, right? So it takes longer than normal for Horus to stack this up. Longer than a lot of his competition, frankly. So it's generally not worth trying to build this, because by the time you do get this stacked, the game's almost over. In all honesty, you're already at the team fighting phase, you're in the late game stage, and you're not going to have the kinds of protections out of Prophetic Cloak as a result that you would have from just Gauntlet of Thebes. Additionally, since Horus does in fact have only 2 significantly damaging abilities, he's less likely to accidentally kill a minion. It's very easy to simply not kill minions with Horus, especially since for one of his abilities, very specifically the Fracture, he has to sort of deliberately aim Fracture to hit minions. If you saw the previous episode on Horus in the solo lane, then you would know that Fracture can be used to clear waves, but it doesn't have to be. Same thing with his Updraft, right? Not really that big of a deal. So it's not actually that problematic to grab stacks with Gauntlet of Thebes with Horus. So this is my go-to second item here. In most cases, again, if the enemy team composition is particularly wacky, I'll adjust to a different aura item, but, what have you. Now let's talk about the third item, which in most compositions is going to be physical. Again, if the enemy team is magic heavy, you would want to do your magic protection item here, but I'm just going to talk about his physical protection options, what I like and what I don't like, and why really quick here. Now, my personal favorite does happen to be Gladiator's Shield. I find Horus is very effective with this a lot of the time because, again, you do get a little bit of extra damage out of your healing, so if you've just healed an ally, you've got boosted 30 protections. Considering that's 35% of your protections, that's, you know, a modest 10 damage increase, which doesn't sound like a lot, but I can tell you from support personal experience that 10 damage extra on a support is quite a lot. This doesn't even include the other protections he's going to be kicking around with, right? It's nice, right? It's not strictly necessary, but Gladiator's Shield does give you a lot of benefits besides you get cooldown, you get physical protections, of course. It's just a great all-around item on him. So I am very fond of this, but this is by no means the only item that's great on Horus. What is going to surprise you a little bit is Phalanx is really effective. It's more effective on solo Horus, I'm going to be really blunt here. But this can be very effective on, again, more particularly solo Horus, because you can heal your allied minions, and if you get basic attacked by an enemy god, boom, your minions are now, they're attacking faster, they're more durable, plus the heal. And with Fracture, you can reduce the enemy's protections, which means your minions are going to hit harder, which is just a lovely time. And this actually translates even better into the late game when you start getting Fire minions down lane, Oni minions down lane. It can get fairly ugly fairly quickly if you decide to go with flanks. Again, not really something I build on support Horus. This is better for solo lane Horus, but I'll talk about that when I get to the solo lane Horus. Alright. Now I am also very fond of Breastplate of Regrowth on solo lane Horus. If you don't want to do the whole minion thing on solo lane Horus, you've got Breastplate of Regrowth. Again, solo lane Horus, it's just with this, I have a problem with this one item. This makes it very difficult for the enemy junglers, in most cases, to gank solo lane Horus. Again, I'll talk about this more in detail. I don't really like this on support Horus, though, because this promotes the idea primarily of running away. It's difficult to chase enemies with this effect with Horus's ability, because Protector's Surge does fly you to an ally, and if you're flying to an ally as support Horus, it's to save their life, alright? You're not doing it because you're trying to chase down an enemy, you're doing it to save their lives. Likely this means they aren't running towards the enemy, they are likely running away from the enemy. So it's difficult to use this as a chasing mechanic if you need it, and support Horus really shouldn't be running away and leaving his team to die. He just really shouldn't be, right? So I don't like the kind of mindset this can create for a support Horus, and again, it's not something he can really effectively use. This is much more effective on solo lane Horus. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I do really like Contagion as an anti-heal item on him now, considering that when you're hit by hard crowd control, and again, you have the potential here to reduce enemy protections with Fracture, they're going to be taking a little bit more magic damage, because that magic damage, just like with the equally potentially effective item Mystical Mail, both Mystical Mail and Contagion are affected by protections. So reducing protections means these hit a little harder, which is really nice to see. Alright. For support Horus, if I really need anti-heal, this is usually my go-to. Every once in a while, the enemy team composition has such a high amount of attack speed-based gods that I want Toxic Blade, which, incidentally, again, this is very important, that Gust is an auto-attack, so you can actually start triggering this off of that Gust. Okay? Fun fact. So if the enemy team composition has a high amount of auto-attackers, yeah, I'll bust out Toxic Blade, but for the rest of the time, if I need anti-healing, a nice Contagion is a really good thing, right? Lovely time. Absolutely fantastic. Again, Mystical Mail, if you want to double down on the auras, you can with Sovereignty and Heart Ward. I usually don't. Every once in a while I will if the enemy team composition is unusually high in damage, but not very often. Of course, Midgardian Mail is always an effective item on Horus. It's just a plain old, effective item in general. The Emperor's Armor is an interesting case where between Updraft, the slow on the Gust, and the stun on Fracture, and the protection reduction from Fracture, Horus can use this. I don't personally build it too often. I'll sometimes bust it out when my team is falling behind early and we're just defending towers more often. It can be nice there, but it's not quite as stupidly powerful on Horus as it is on, say, Atlas. Atlas is a much better use of this item. But it can be very effective on Horus, again, if your team is falling behind really early in the game, and you just need that little bit of extra defensive boost. You know, your back is to the wall, you bust out the Emperor's armor, and suddenly the wall is starting to shoot the enemy a little bit harder, right? Just a strange analogy, but I think you get what I'm saying here. It's not a bad item, but it's not something I'll go out of my way for, right? And with the Midgardian Mail, I'll only really build this, again, if there's a heavy amount of auto-attackers on the enemy team, and even then I might prefer Toxic Blade in that particular instance if I need the anti-healing, but that's not physical protection. Again, I personally have a preference for Gladiator's Shield. Current meta really rewards splashing in a little bit of damage here, so I like Gladiator's Shield, but if you prefer one of these other physical items that I've mentioned, maybe the enemy team composition has a lot of crit people. Maybe they've got Jingwei and Mercury, right? Maybe you want to bust out a Spectral Armor. Totally fine, right? That is very, very much a viable option. But you could also build Lotus Sickle. I will give you this. I don't personally build this a ton. If I'm going to be building something that'll increase allied protections, I'd rather have the constancy of a specific aura I need. For example, in this particular case, if against a standard team composition of 3 physical, 2 magic, I would rather have Sovereignty than Lotus Sickle, personally. It gives you more physical protections. It gives you an ally's HP 5. It gives the same amount of protections to allies, but not on a timer. And if you're facing off against, say, a 3 or 4 physical comp, you really don't need that many more magic protections being provided. You're already providing 30 with your heal. You're providing 10 with Gauntlet of Thebes. You're providing bonus with Sentinel's Embrace later on. I just find Lotus Sickle to not be as effective as a 3rd or 4th item as an inappropriate aura against the enemy team would be. Alright, so I don't personally like this. I think Sovereignty or Heart Ward, depending on the enemy team composition, is just a stronger pick. Alright? In my opinion. With that being said, let's go with my usual example, a Delicious Gladiator's Shield. Now, for magic protections, it gets a little bit interesting, right? I recommended Fablast Hoops. It's a great item. You get cooldowns, MP5, magic protections, a lot of health, and your allies get the flower from the healing, right? Now, this is different from the Lotus Crown, because the Lotus Crown, again, as I stated before, can very easily be replaced by the appropriate protection item, the appropriate aura defense increaser. There's nothing really that can emulate what Fablast Hoops does, and it actually makes your heal still worth using, even if the enemy team has a lot of anti-healing, and unfortunately for Horus, anti-healing is more powerful than it ever has been before in the history of Smite. So to have your heal do something beyond just healing, in this particular case dropping health shield flowers, that can really allow that ability to maintain a utility use throughout the match besides just zipping you over to an ally, right? It can really help. So I'm really fond of Fablast Hoops. If you don't want Fablast Hoops, then I have 2 other recommendations for you. The first is Genji's Guard. Now, with the amount of ways that people can build penetration nowadays, it is a bit riskier to be a support. It is a little harder to survive. Not a ton harder, but a little bit harder to survive now. There's a bit more penetration options. There's a bit more ways of dealing with tanks. I'll go on record to say the Cyclopean Ring is a hair too strong. Leaving that aside for the moment, this essentially what I'm leading up to is that it's not too unusual for supports to be chosen as the victim of initiation. Normally, up until very recently, you wouldn't normally want to initiate on the enemy support, but with all these items kicking around now, it's not always necessarily a bad idea. Genji's Guard, because most supports are magic, Genji's Guard can be really effective, where it is still providing you with a lot of magic protections and 10% cooldowns. But what you might be instead more interested in doing would be using this to more quickly escape from an initiation attempt. You get the cooldowns are reduced by 3 seconds. Lovely. If your Protector's Surge wasn't active before, it is now. You can fly away to an enemy. It's a lovely time. Very rarely do I build this. I'm usually going Fabulous Hoops. Another option, which can be very interesting and I've built against specific enemies, is Absolution. Now, the tricky thing about Horus's ult is, as I said before, enemies can see that landing. They can see that zone you're landing in. They can see how long it's going to take to land. They can prepare for it, including such gods as Hades, Gilgamesh, Poseidon, all of whom can lay down some really heavy AoE crowd control in that area where you're landing. Well, Absolution will help your allies get out of that if that starts happening. If I see a Poseidon on the enemy team, I'm probably going to grab Absolution at some point. I just don't want to be ulting into a whirlpool and have my allies get killed by a follow-up Kraken, right? Absolution, well, it's not a huge deal. It does give your team at least a little bit of time to react and get away from the area with their escape abilities, assuming they have any. Right? So, this is conditionally useful against certain specific gods, ones that have a lot of crowd control focused on a specific area, which can make it worth picking up, but usually I'm going for Fabulous Hoops in a lot of these situations, alright? So we're going to run with that here in this example. Now, your last two items on Horus really are quite flexible. You can build a cloak, you can build all kinds of things, you can emphasize more protections if you need more protections of a particular type. But let me introduce you to a fascinating little combo that I've found with Horus. The first item of this combo is the Stone of Binding. Alright, successfully hitting an enemy god with crowd control will place a debuff on them. Now, what they don't say, this is a typo, I'm sure, is that that is hard crowd control. Alright, there's a bit of an important difference there. Slows don't count. So this, at level 20, this is a 25 protection reduction, plus the flat 30 of Fracture. And now you're looking at a consistent protection debuff of 55. For anyone not building tank, that's pretty much true damage, alright? And besides that, it gives you some health and both protection types, which is just a lovely time. And then you grab Rune-Forged Hammer, your next successful hard CC, and you've got 3 of them technically on your ult too. An enemy god creates a runic symbol on the ground that lasts for 5 seconds. Enemies in that symbol take 10% more damage. Now, this is something I mentioned previously as really being good on Horus, but that was when it only affected one target. Now, the entire enemy team, if they're standing on that circle or even sneeze close enough to it, they're going to get affected by this. And this is a huge, huge area. If you have not seen this, the size of this area, it is absolutely massive. Check this out. Boom. That is a huge area for a symbol to cover, right? And that's increasing all enemies' damage intake by 10% if they're standing in that ring. Combine that, like I said, with the protection reductions from Fracture, and you have a really unholy combination there. And this is one of my favorite things to do with Horus. Now, every once in a blue moon, I'll buy Caduceus Club, because I'll only buy Caduceus Club if there are other healers on my team. You know, maybe I've got a Hell on my team for mid lane, and I've got a solo lane Chang'e. Alright, that's a lot of healing on the team. I'm going to want to be grabbing Caduceus Club to increase both my healing and theirs, right? But beyond that, you can build any of these cloaks if you want to as well. That is also totally an option. But these last couple of items are somewhat flexible, right? In that regard. These two just happen to be my favorite combination. It's really powerful. Really quick note, by the way, for Winged Blade, I don't really build this because Horus can just fly to whoever he needs, so he's not really that concerned about it. Forgot to mention that. But beyond that, for a lot of the rest of the items, except, again, the cloaks, which you can build anything but Prophetic Cloak and be fine, a lot of these are, you know, I don't build Berserker's Shield on support Horus, but I build that sometimes on solo or Horus. I'll talk about that later. Of course, Mail of Renewal, that still has a 1-minute cooldown, and healing items are stronger than ever. This is moot at this point. Cannonier's Cutlass, next successful basic attack causes it to explode. Horus doesn't need to clear lanes as a support. That's fine. Ignore that. Stone of Gaia, Horus heals himself. Doesn't really need this, right? But this is my usual go-to build for support Horus right now. Alright, and keep in mind that I don't have these stacks. Let me grab these stacks so you can see the full protection amount. Where does the stacks go? There they are. Boom. Right? That is a really nice amount of protections for both of those protections, right? Great. Absolutely fantastic. Now, you're probably wondering, well, Professor, you said you build solo lane very similarly. What changes? Well, what changes is primarily the first 3 items in most cases, right? Let me remove these. Obviously, we don't keep Gauntlet of Thebes as a... Actually, we'll remove this too as an example. Obviously, one thing that doesn't change is... I don't usually change the last 2 items. It's just such a powerful combination on Horus, regardless of what role you're playing. It's just too hideous. But when I'm playing a solo lane Horus, regardless of whether I'm going damage or defense, I'm going for Warrior's Axe. I'll talk about the damage solo Horus in a bit. Then my very next move is the physical protections of my choice. And again, just as a brief reminder, if I'm concerned about getting ganked, I'll bust out Breastplate of Regrowth very specifically so I'm difficult to gank, fly to your minion wave if it's there, and you're running like the Dickens back to tower. Very easy, very quick escape, right? Or flanks if I need a bit of help fighting my laning opponent. Maybe it's a bad matchup, right? Perhaps. So I bust out flanks to help me out, right? Totally possible. Great items. But other than that, any of these items will really work. Great. So let's grab... let's grab Shield of Regrowth just for kicks. I'm really fond of this on solo lane Horus. Then, after we get that, our next move is very specifically our usual dual protections. Now, I always have advocated for your third item being protections. You might be wondering here, well, Professor, what about Golden Blade? We'll get to that. Nowadays, with the nice boost in Breastplate of Regrowth and the way this is more effective, this is a great item. Of course, we've got the Warrior's Axe to deal damage now, which is really great. There's reasons for that. Hold on. But now we'll build our dual protection item. This is where I bust out Manticore's Spike. Now, I don't normally bust out Manticore's Spike as a solo lane Horus. I've actually avoided talking about it outright, even though it can be very good on support Horus, because primarily in that situation, for a support Horus very specifically, I'd rather have the runic symbol on the ground. Alright, it can potentially affect more targets at the same time. So, I do prefer, for the support Horus, I do prefer Runic Hammer, right? Manticore's Spikes is a little bit more personal. Pick up the item, do with the extra damage. It works a little better on solo lane because they're generally not being messed with, so they're free to do whatever they want to each other, right? So we also have that. It also gives you MP5, which you want as a solo laner, right? In this particular instance, and again, if you want to flip the physical and magic items, that's fine, but I also tend to build Genji's Guard here instead of Fabulous Hoops, remember. And again, if the laning opponent is magic, you would build Genji's Guard second. But the reason why I don't really build Fabulous Hoops on Horus in the solo lane is because I'm not necessarily going to be near any allies or anything like that to help essentially, maximize these items. So, I don't have any allies to heal with Fabulous Hoops. I don't know why I said minions, but it just is unnecessary, right? So I usually go Genji's Guard to emulate a lot of the parts of Fabulous Hoops that I like. The magic protections, the health, the cooldown, a little bit of the MP5, right? Not as much health, obviously, not as much defense, honestly, but it's acceptable. So this is usually where I'll build out these items. Again, I leave these 2 back here because it's just a really incredible combination. You don't have to if you don't want to. And then I go into, of course, Sundering Axe. And you can see I have a pretty decent amount of protections. I've got some nice damage sources. It's a lovely time, right? But now you're probably wondering, Professor, what about Damage Horus? Well, we still build Warrior's Axe, but what we do instead is quite a bit different from there on. Now, it is at this point that I usually will run Golden Blade. Now, why run Golden Blade on Damage Horus and not Tank Horus? Well, the reason why Golden Blade I build on damage Horus and not, well, damage solo Horus and not tank solo Horus is because with the addition of the breastplate of regrowth and the ability of it to essentially make ganking you nigh impossible for all but a half dozen junglers, such as Thanatos, Ratatoskir, and Thor as prime examples, any jungler basically that can skip over your wards is still going to pose a problem. But for every other jungler out in existence, Breastplate of Regrowth is going to make ganking you a nigh impossibility. Alright? But back to the point. Because of this, and the protections it gets you, and the fact that it boosts your power by 15, means that even though Tank Horus doesn't have Golden Blade and doesn't clear quite as quickly, he now has the protections, the mana, and the cooldowns instead to be able to essentially outlast the enemy, right? Primarily. That's what's really changed. And even if you don't build Breastplate of Regrowth specifically, maybe you bust out Gladiator's Shield. Gladiator's Shield is providing you with a little bit more protections, a little bit more health than it used to, because it dropped the power. It has HP 5 now. So you can out-sustain and out-endure your laning opponent, even if you don't clear as quickly as them. And again, you still have Fracture if you're really good with that, and you can heal your minions. Again, healing your minions is a little bit more rewarding with Shield of Regrowth, in my opinion. But you still can use that very effectively to outlast your laning opponent as a tank solo Horus. Alright? Essentially. But, damage Horus, damage solo Horus, you are looking to do damage, obviously. And Golden Blade offers a lot of benefits besides. Now, you're not going to be leaping right into the damage, although you can. I'll get to that in a bit. But Golden Blade is something that's going to provide you with a lot of benefits. In the previous episode with Solo Lane Horus, you saw Golden Blade really kick ass in one team fight. That is absolutely very viable, but the way we build Horus throughout as a damaged solo laner with the new itemization is a bit different. But we absolutely can build protections as the second item. I don't normally, but sometimes if it gets really ugly, I do. Now, what is the difference here? When do I decide to start damage Horus with protections? Because obviously as a solo laner, we still want a certain amount of protections. That's why we keep Warrior's Axe, one of the reasons. Well, there's a couple of reasons. A couple of things that causes me to specifically go into protections first. One, my laning opponent isn't a warrior or a guardian. If my laning opponent is a hunter or a mage, I'm going to start with the protections. They're going to hit me a little harder. The mage is going to clear way faster than I am, considerably faster than I am. And so I'll want the protections, either physical or magical, depending on the mage. Most of the time it's magical. And I'll want to very specifically be busting out protections in that case, because they'll be out clearing me, and they'll be trying to box me, and I'll be trying to box them and their minions. It's just a mess. So I'll want protections there. For hunters, their single target damage is very high, so I need to rush those protections before building up my damage, because otherwise I'm never going to outdamage them. I'm a warrior, they're a hunter, for Pete's sakes, right? That kind of goes without saying. So I need the protections first to be able to at least meet them in the middle here in terms of damage after I build my own damage, which in this case would be Golden Blade, right? So these first, with the exception of Warrior's Axe, the first three items I'll be talking about here, I always build, but the order changes depending upon the needs of the situation. Now, usually I will go into Berserker's Shield, and you're probably detecting a theme at this point. This is because there is. I find Damage Horus works really well with the Axe of Animosity now that it's not tied down to Benevolence. You see, the only reason I really didn't build Animosity on Solo Lane Horus before is because it was attached to the unfortunate Benevolence, and Solo Lane Horus already has a hard enough time in the really early game first 3 levels. Hell, even the first 4 levels, Horus has a really hard time, and also don't forget that his ult is not really something you use while boxing, alright? So, crippling his early game even more by building Benevolence rather than something more sensible like Warrior's Axe really just made it nearly impossible to make a comeback. Even if you wanted Animosity. Even if you got Animosity, oftentimes you were so far behind it was too late, right? But now that Animosity effect is tied to a Warrior's Axe evolution, this actually gives him a lot of great leeway, where you can easily build into this and suffer no early game penalty like you would have an update ago. Alright? But because Horus's ult is meaningless in boxing, and he can't do damage with Protector's Surge, his actual best avenue for damage is auto attacks. Now keep in mind that Gust is going to trigger all of these. It's going to trigger Golden Blade, it's going to trigger Animosity when we build that. It's going to trigger all of these. Furthermore, Fracture is of course still going to reduce their protections, which means your auto attacks are going to hit harder, including the magic damage from the Animosity effect. That's also going to hit harder because that is also affected by protections, and you reduce both protections. Alright, so auto attack Horus is actually the best way to do damage with Horus, rather than ability based, which is what a lot of people would assume. I only really rely on my abilities for damage as support and defense solo, because you can grab Gladiator's Shield and run with that. Right, along with, of course, Runic Hammer and Stone of Binding. Right? Damage Horus? Animosity all the way. So we want to set up for that with Berserker's Shield. And then usually I'll go for, not this, Shogun's Kusari, right? Cooldowns, attack speed, lovely time. Now again, just as a reminder, Golden Blade, Berserker's Shield, and Shogun's Kusari, the order of these is flexible depending on your needs. Alright? If the enemy does more damage than you, if the enemy is going to outdamage you, you expect that. Protections first. Now, you'll also notice this is the first time I haven't recommended a item 3 or 4 dual protections. This is because we're going Damage Horus. However, Damage Horus, you can build literally almost anything in these last 2 slots. I'm not even kidding. Is the enemy abnormally tanky? Absolutely bust out Chin Size. Do you have an abnormally large amount of physical damage dealers on your team? Grab Executioner. The Gust will trigger that. The Gust will trigger Chin Size. Go for it. You want... There's nothing here that's useful to him, actually. You want to do more auto attacks and have some decent ability damage on your abilities, too? The Crusher is a great choice. Go for it. You know, you want to grab some penetration? Serrated Edge. Although that's not my favorite. I also don't usually build crits on him, either. Do you want to run Hydra's Lament and do bonus damage based on your power? Go to town. Absolutely. Fantastic. Right? You can also build protection items. Again, we can talk about Stone of Binding. Great item on him, even as Damage Horus. You could go Archdruid's Fury, but considering how easily you can reduce protections, I find that there's not much need for true damage on Horus, personally. Same kind of thing with Abyssal Stone. Well, the thing is, pop-ups, or knock-ups as the game calls them, this isn't affected by this, because those are very specific amount of time. It's a physical motion, more so than a timed crowd control, like stun or sleep. Those are timed crowd controls and would be affected by this. Fracture would be affected by this, but to build Abyssal Stone just to improve Fracture's durability, it's not really worth it. Sure, your allies get the benefit of this as well, but maybe you're alone. I mean, this is solo lane Horus, right? And for support Horus, by the way, Stone of Binding is just straight up better. But yeah, I'm not the biggest fan of Abyssal Stone. And it's terrible on support Horus. Solo Horus. Alright. You could still go with Manticore Spikes as a solo Horus. Great option. Right? Toxic Blade, of course. You could also just as likely go into, any of these again. No problem. That works great too. A Cloak, sure, as long as it's, once again, not prophetic. It's too hard to stack in the solo lane. But a lot of these items work really effectively on him, including the famous Stone of Binding and the... Stone of Binding and the Runic Hammer. Also great item there, right? Absolutely fantastic. I don't generally recommend Dawnbringer. I just find it to be too weak in terms of protection boosting. 5% isn't a whole lot. We're talking about an increase of 15 protections when you have 300 protections. No thanks. But yeah, you can build a lot of different interesting items on Horus. Again, some of the things that I like doing, and I mentioned these specifically because I hadn't talked about them before, Executioner to reduce enemy physical protections? Sure. Shin Size for enemy tanks? Absolutely. Go for it, right? It absolutely works wonders, right? I do tend to still at least build Stone of Binding. I have to admit, even if I'm going Damage Horus, I'm still looking a lot of the times at this, and then go into Animosity. I just really like this. This is a really great build, in my opinion, to deal a decent amount of damage, still have some good protections, and also, you know, bust lips. But if you want to, you could absolutely still go with a bit more on the terms of heavier damage, with Chin Size, Executioner, or Hydra's Lament, great choice, you know? Now, you may have noticed I haven't really extensively talked about Pridwen. Pridwen is still good on Horus. I am not saying it's not. However, due to the fact that warriors now have an inherent 5 to 10% cooldown reduction just automatically based on their level, I find that Pridwen is unnecessary now. Now keep in mind that Support Horus was busting my usual build on Support Horus, incorporated Gladiator Shield, 10% cooldowns, and then the famous Fabulous Hoops, another 10% cooldowns. At level 20, Horus has natural 10% cooldowns, bringing him to 30%, and the famous Potion of Power gives you 10% cooldown for 5 minutes. I just don't need Pridwen. You're going to way overcap with this, in all honesty. So while the ult shield still is great, and the protections are still good, I just find a lot of the times it's very unnecessary. There are other items I would prefer to build in the same slot, right? But that's really how I adjust for Damage Horus. Again, those last 2 items for Damage Solo Horus is very much a matter of personal taste. Now, for relics, pick your favorite. There's really no wrong relic. Obviously, if you're solo lane Horus, grab Teleport Fragment. Obviously, if you're going against someone like Odin, you want Magic Shell. But otherwise, go ham with whatever you prefer. But let's talk about shards, because that's a bit more specific. Generally speaking, to combine with the Unholy Fracture, I generally go with Carapace Shard. Furthermore, again, Gust is a basic attack. You can hit the Carapace Shard effect from a distance using that, okay? Which is going to catch a lot of people off guard. And I generally build this on both support and solo lane Horus. The only real exception to this is the auto attack damage solo Horus, in which case I'll usually bust out Wing Shard, okay? With that one exception, my go-to is Carapace Shard, because again, I can slap that person with reduced protections from a distance with my Gust auto attack, which they're not going to be expecting, and then my allies can just go to town from there, right? It's incredibly effective on Horus. I think Horus is probably one of the best uses of Carapace Shard in the game, at least right now, and in my opinion, alright? But I love Carapace Shard on this man. So, that is very specifically how I approach building Horus: damage solo, defense solo, or tank solo, and support. Alright? With that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.